I'm James Warren.
And I'm Andy Cushen.
And this is the Denver Urbanism Podcast, a podcast on all things city building in the loud city of Denver. Wow, that was some beautiful intro music, and it was, maybe some would say, a little too loud. What do you think, Andy?
Well, I think it's helpful to focus our time and attention on noise. This is a very opportune moment to focus our time and attention on noise in this city. And a little bit of a jarring start to an episode just makes you think a little bit more like, oh, why am I listening at this volume? Or where am I? Was this too loud for the room I'm in? And my partner who's across the room is tired of me playing these things out loud instead of using headphones. Noise in Denver, as I say, is kind of a hot topic right now. We have a noise ordinance that already exists. And earlier this year, it was reported in Westward, Denverite, a couple other places that the city's Department of Public Health and Environment, DDPHE, was looking at doing some updates to the existing noise ordinance. The existing noise ordinance was done in 2008. This is Chapter 36 of Denver's Revised Municipal Code. I do not advise you to go and read Denver's Revised Municipal Code. It's pretty boring. But the updates are, I would say that they were a little overhyped at the time.
Interesting.
And I think that this is a good opportunity for us to, again, focus attention on what a noise ordinance in Denver actually does, and in a broader sense, the problem of noise in our cities.
Yeah, so I guess let's start there. Let's get into the ordinance, and then we can talk a little bit more broadly. Why are we regulating noise in the first place? You know, it's a city. It's supposed to be loud. What are you crazy urbanists talking about?
Some historical sort of words of wisdom here. A Nobel Prize winner in 1910 once predicted that one day man will have to fight noise as fiercely as cholera and pest. And since 1972, the World Health Organization declared noise a pollutant. So for Denver to regulate a pollutant, they do that in all sorts of other ways. We regulate the emission of certain chemicals. This is why this is going through CDPHE as the Department of Public Health and Environment. The noise control ordinance that we have, it kind of actually makes a lot of sense once you start to imagine noise, especially extremely loud and unwelcome noise, as a pollutant. We don't really think about it that way. I mean, when you're having a conversation with your friend, you don't typically greet your friend by saying, well, you're really polluting my air. But just like other emissions, this is something that can be quantified, controlled, measured, and ultimately there's some really compelling research about how chronic, loud noise, even if it's not enough to actually damage your hearing, which of course really loud noise does, it still affects people's health, affects people's ability to concentrate, sleep, their heart health, all sorts of other things. So we have a noise ordinance for the same reason we have other ordinances against dumping trash in illegal places. You know, it's a pollutant.
Yeah, that's interesting. And I can attest to this just personally. I'm somebody who responds very negatively to loud noises and very positively to quiet noises. I've measured my heart rate walking by loud noises, and it never dips below 95. I mean, I have this physiological reaction to being near roads and other loud spaces, construction sites, but put me next to a park where I can hear people talking and birds singing and just the quiet of the outdoors, and I feel totally at ease. So I can understand why, as we try to look after the city's public health and our city's environment, why this is something that we're doing here.
So the noise ordinance is also something that you, as a regular person, would also want to know about, because one thing that is difficult sometimes about living in the urban environment, regardless of whether or not you had thought of noise as a pollutant before beginning to listen to this podcast, you know that sometimes noises are pesky or frustrating. The sound of a siren in the middle of the night racing down your street or your alley or something like that. Your neighbor playing music too loud. Occasionally it makes the news that I think it was the number 38, the bar in Rhino, was sued by a couple neighbors for making too much noise too late at night. Regular people do understand that this noise ordinance does have some teeth to it, and that you can crack down on your neighbors, whether they're institutional or residential neighbors, for being too loud. You know, the noise ordinance exists in a way that it should actually assist you as a person living and taking up space wherever you are listening to this right now. You really have a right to a certain level of protection from noise.
So let's talk about the ordinance then. Okay, so let's just, talk about from sort of the upshot. These are the things that I remember from the articles. They are changing the times at which refuse trucks can operate to assist in waste management. I think that's pretty great. There was an increase from 80 to 85 decibels for the noise floor, at which point you're breaking the noise barrier, and we can talk about that.
There's actually some subtle stuff, too, about essentially removing completely, like, snow clearing as a potential violation of the noise ordinance, especially under emergency circumstances. I thought that was kind of cute. There's a new method for petitioning the director of Denver's Department of Public Health and Environment for specific construction activities that are near people and make too much noise for that to normally be permitted. You can go and petition DDPHE because there's special circumstances, versus in the past we were just sort of essentially letting people getting away with breaking the rules because the difficult circumstances of the given construction site.
And there's jake breaking, which let's dive into each one of these. Maybe we don't need to worry about snow plows. We know you're gonna plow the roads, and we can probably all get on board for that. But let's take a look at the waste management, the increase of the decibel level, the jake breaking, and then also that enforcement piece that you're talking about, petitioning CDPHE. So let's start right there at the top. I think that this is a great example of what we're trying to do here in a city. We all want our trash collected. We all want this picked up. And as a result, I say, you know what? Sometimes it's fine for heavy machinery to drive down my neighborhood street that spews diesel and sulfur into the air and maybe spreads some trash around, because the trade-off is I get all the trash out of my house and I don't have to worry about it.
I'll say I think this ordinance matters in the particular case of trash pickup because also included of Chapter 36 of this particular part of the municipal code is a requirement that any city dollar spent either on contractors or enforcement or projects, it has to follow its own ordinance. So right now, Denver sort of has a, how shall we call it, a competitive disadvantage at doing construction projects, trash pickup, and all these other things because they have to follow their own rules to the letter of the ordinance. And you can essentially be a violator of this ordinance currently, and unless somebody reports you, you've just picked up trash a little easier and earlier and faster and before there's other people on the road or other people on the sidewalk. The city specifically cites the need for modified trash pickup hours because we've also decided that we want more types of trash handled in the city. Both by the city itself, we now do pay as you throw, so compost, recycling, those are both being picked up more often and with specific bins, specific trucks, and then trash is being picked up just as frequently as it was before, right? So it's a higher volume of actual pickup activity that's required. And then also the city cites there's people walking on the streets. And so if you start a little earlier in the morning when there's not people walking and the trucks are pulling out of alleys, you actually are also lessening conflict there. And then the Waste No More ordinance, again, right now the city's at somewhat of a competitive disadvantage because they have to follow their own rules. And I bet you, take a look in your own alley this week, dear listener, you will find that some non-city vehicle is moving very loudly down your alley before the hour of 6 a.m. to pick up trash or clean something or do whatever it's doing, even though that's not allowed. So this also changes the rules so that those other companies maybe don't get cited for trying to help with, again, another expansion. We've approved Waste No More as an ordinance. So apartment buildings in the next couple of years need to start doing composting. Businesses need to do composting. We want this specific expansion of this waste stream, and we want it in a specific timeline. So this noise ordinance needs to happen so that the city can actually play by the rules and get this kind of service done.
That's really good context, and that's helpful for me to understand too. Let's move on to that second thing. We increased the noise ceiling, I guess, at which you go through that, and now you're starting to be in violation. This runs afoul of a few of my sensibilities. I think that we should sort of be striving toward saying, well, it's 80, but we're going to bring it down to 75, right? Like long term, we want to encourage quieter streets, quieter neighborhoods. Were you able to read anything about why specifically they moved that ceiling from 80 to 85 decibels?
There seems to be two simultaneous possibilities here. So I mentioned number 38 in Rhino. This is a pretty cool space if you've ever been to it. A little too hip for me and my partner, but I have been there. I can get it. I can get into it. That is a space that got in trouble for violating the noise ordinance, even though it is operating exactly as the business was originally planned to operate and approved by every other apparatus in the city. So by raising the decibel limit just a little bit, that's a bit of relief to places like Local 38, and probably other places that didn't get the same press but have this kind of struggle. Like, my friends live just off Santa Fe Drive. There's a private club right on Santa Fe Drive. It frustrates them that that place is noisy until somewhat late at night. The hours of allowed noise didn't change here, but the decibel limit sort of increased. And then there's also a specific thing about the number of subsequent days that you can get in trouble for violating the limit, because again, there's a balance here of when places break the rules, unless it's enforced, there's really no benefit for then the places that play by the rules. Yeah. And who else plays by the rules? Well, the city. When the city has a public event or contracts to do a concert in Civic Center Park or something like that. You know, we just had the Outside Festival. Fleet Foxes played in Civic Center Park. Yeah, you know, imagine your favorite Fleet Foxes song here. Don't play it though, copyright reasons. I think the city also wants that same competitive advantage there about how much they can put on using their own resources. We're a really well-known music city. We already have two really incredible venues that people think of all the time, Levitt Pavilion and Red Rocks, you know, that are managed by the city. Red Rocks is not subject to the same limitations here. Right, obviously, they're playing concerts way into the night, but for a place like Levitt Pavilion, a place like Civic Center, and expansion of new concerts in different places, this is, I think, more in the relief category and trying to get back a little bit of the competition between what the city wants to put on itself and what private actors who don't currently play by the rules are sort of getting away with.
Just for some context, just so people are aware, noise is usually measured in decibels, and decibels is a logarithmic scale. So going from 70 to 80 decibels is actually a tenfold increase in the amount of power that you're getting. And so it's not simply going from 80 to 85 is really nothing to sneeze at. It's a pretty substantial increase. 85 decibels is what's considered hazardous by the CDC at 8 hours of prolonged exposure, right? So if you're on a construction site and it's at 85 decibels, the CDC starts to say, okay, we're going to regulate this. We're going to make sure you're not out there that much longer. Once you get to 90 decibels, it's only around 4 hours of prolonged exposure.
And that's enough to damage your hearing permanently.
Yes. And so that doesn't necessarily take into account other things like higher blood pressure and stress, which are also caused by sound. But that 85 decibels is no joke, right? So going from 80 to 85, even it sounds like there's some good reasons. That's loud noise. And it's a balancing act here, right? We want things happening at Levitt Pavilion. We want clubs to be able to club it up. It's a city, right? But we also want to ensure that we are maintaining a stress-free kind of quiet environment for folks.
This is where we're finding, I think, our first bone to pick with the particular ordinance here, right? You can see it in the press releases and this coverage in Westward and Denverite. The city's gonna city seems to be the sort of feeling here. Oh, well, we're a bigger population city now. So, you know, we're 100,000 people more than when we originally wrote that ordinance. So we need to be a little louder now. Huh? You know, like, in what other context do we treat the emission of more pollutant with more people nearby a better thing? So I think we'll just continue to describe this ordinance. But if you, dear reader, dear listener, feel that this is a little crazy, that we are increasing the pollution limit in this moment, think on that. Think on that.
I also had a viral tweet where I was standing at Louisiana Pearl light rail station, and I had a decibel meter with me because I was curious about light rail stops and other places where people might be waiting for transit and the loud environments they're being exposed to. And it got over 90 decibels in the short clip that I recorded. And I posted it, and I just said, hey, we should consider putting up a sound barrier here to protect people who are waiting at this train station. And wow, people went crazy in the comments. I got called a Hitler particle. I don't know what that is, but it's not a good thing. And people respond very viscerally to us saying, yes, cities are a bit louder than the countryside, but there's a limit to which that sound needs to infiltrate our lives. And, I think over 90 decibels is past that limit. I don't know if 85 decibels is the limit or somewhere further down that scale. But certainly the elephant in the room with some of this is that cars are what make the city loud often. If you're standing by 6, it's not loud because you're in a city. It's loud because you're next to 6. And so too of I-25, so too of Colfax Avenue. It's not just, it's a city, so it's loud. Other cities remain quiet without changing the fact that they're cities.
The noise ordinance currently does have a maximum allowable volume for a car. I find it very difficult to parse, I'll say, and obviously I'm not a lawyer, and this isn't, I also don't work in CDPHE, or DDPHE in this case, excuse me. But for motor vehicles under a certain weight and motor vehicles above a certain weight, there are different allowable levels of noise pollution, essentially. That's baked into the existing ordinance here. And it's another bone of contention I think you and I would pick with this, right? Is that we should probably be targeting less of this pollutant. If we're going to treat it like a pollutant and regulate it like a pollutant, it's just a strange tension we live with where we say that this pollutant is actually sort of acceptable at these really incredibly dangerous levels. I mean, the ordinance says that motor vehicles over 10,000 pounds can emit maximum allowable sound pressure of 90 dBA. That's enough to damage your hearing very quickly, as you've just established.
Let's talk about something else that heavy vehicles do, which I learned the correct term for it, thanks to you, is called jake braking. What is jake braking, and why is it so loud, and what does the ordinance say about that?
Okay, I'm going to give you my impression of the jake braking sound
Yeah,
right here.
please do.
It's that... like that. Well, now that sounds like a sort of racing motorcycle. No. The jake braking noise is the sound of an engine deliberately misfiring compressed air within the engine to turn the momentum of the vehicle to slow it down. Engine braking is very widely used in the state of Colorado. When you're going down really steep grades, I was just on Highway 285, just this last weekend. It tells you engine braking muffler required. Engine braking is commonly understood as a safe way to save your brakes, which are friction brakes, and stop or help slow down your vehicle. It doesn't stop your vehicle, but it uses the momentum of the engine's physical firing of pistons against the forward momentum of the vehicle by sort of deliberately misfiring. So it makes a loud noise as a result. Again, it's totally necessary to use this particular tactic in a large vehicle or even just your regular sports utility vehicle that your buddy drives when you're going down, really steep grades in Colorado's mountains. But within the city of Denver, there's not that many hills, actually. As those of us who live here know, we are somewhat close to the mountains, but we're not that much into the hills. So in this case, the new noise ordinance just proposes a straight ban on jake braking. Jake braking is already banned in a lot of other parts of the country. So, for instance, the city of Portland, it's totally not allowed to jake brake. But it's kind of hard to enforce a noise ordinance against a moving vehicle, especially one that's just sort of passing through the city on its way. This has no nuance, and this is kind of a safety measure. It doesn't say no jake braking without mufflers. It literally just calls out in the proposed ordinance a ban on this particular tactic of slowing down your vehicle. So I'm interested to see how that gets workshopped, because really for a safety reason, it is a necessary tool to help slow down very heavy vehicles, definitely in the mountains. I'm struggling to think of a place where it's really necessary in this city, but it's also really hard to enforce.
That's my next question, which is that you said we can basically, narc on the noise polluters to the director of the Denver Department of Public Health and Environment. Is that the main enforcement mechanism for noise, or are cops driving around with really quiet sirens?
I think no. It is absolutely DDPHE. They do also have a proposed change in here that wouldn't require an inspector to directly witness it if they are sent some credible evidence by the person who is witnessing the noise. For instance, right now, construction work is only allowed between, I'm going to get this wrong, but on the weekends it's 9 to 5, right? Saturday and Sunday, you can only do construction work in the city and county of Denver from 9 a.m. to 5 p.m. unless you have some sort of special waiver.
Okay.
And it's very common, I work in the Golden Triangle, it's very common to hear residents complain about work on the weekends that is happening outside of those hours. but they right now have to get like an inspector to come down at like 6 p.m. on a Saturday and witness that. And I assume DDPHE does not want to pay overtime for somebody to work at like 6 o'clock on a Saturday on the off chance of catching a noise violation. So this helps modernize that as well to make it really easy for all you narcs out there.
Yeah, noise narcs, get on it.
Narcs, get on it.
Okay, that's all helpful information in the context of this ordinance. But broadly, what do we want out of a city? I think you've touched on this a lot, but why are we regulating noise? What are we trying to get at as a city with this?
Well, the ambition in these rules is to make the city work like a city. But the ambition that I think most of us have in our lives when we make choices about where to live, how to get around, where to have that conversation or take that phone call, where to sit outside in order to enjoy our dining, is calm, comfort, peace of mind, quiet. Those are wonderful feelings. People want to go to a park and experience that feeling of calm and peace. We have wildlife that lives in this city. Right. It's very well documented that urban noise adversely affects the habits of native species. There was a UN report in 2021 that, just as a side note, mentioned that there was a species of birds in Bogota, Colombia that had adapted to the morning rush hour by doing their morning calls an hour earlier than birds located outside the city. So this has a really big impact. If we treat this like pollution, we start to see that what we really need are a lot more engineering solutions and policy solutions, not just stricter enforcement. But for instance, right now, we have street classifications in Denver. And we say, this is a local street, this is a collector street, and this is an arterial street. And a lot of people are very fired up on, well, I don't want X street in my neighborhood to be classified as this kind of roadway because it allows a speed limit that's higher. A higher speed limit means more noise. I'll just point that out. We don't have aspirational levels of noise in different neighborhoods in Denver right now. And what is found, there was a CSU study from last year that found that noise pollution and unacceptable levels of noise happen disproportionately in historically red-line neighborhoods. This is a really great study. I do not have academic access to read the full study, but at least the brief blog post on CSU's website was really wonderful, and I will post that in the show notes for this.
I'll download a PDF and drop it in the show notes so we can all access.
Oh, sure, of course, absolutely. Yeah. Well, regardless, if we had an aspiration for a city with less pollution, just like less carbon emissions, just like less of the urban heat island effect, we would understand that containing noise and limiting loud noise close to where people live and work, that's a good thing, and we would just take new tactics to make that happen. I think it is happening as sort of a side effect of other things. So for instance, this summer, York and Josephine, north of 17th Avenue, are getting a road diet. That's awesome. I think that's great. It's like hardly getting any press. It's great. Going from 4 lanes to 3 lanes is going to slow people down, and a lower volume of cars there on that street is going to mean less noise for the neighbors that live right there along York and Josephine. But we should be thinking about this holistically.
As you talk about this, I'm just sort of thinking what I would do if I was the czar of noise in the city and I had unlimited power. So I guess thinking about these in different contexts, right? So in the neighborhoods, we have these neighborhoods that are just straight up grids. And that encourages, if there's a collector street with some construction happening on it, it encourages people to drive through the neighborhood streets as fast as they might on that collector street, which of course is more dangerous and it's going to be louder. And so if we broke up that grid a little bit, if neighborhood streets ended in certain pockets, you would essentially break up that grid and people would not drive through the neighborhoods anymore because it would be less convenient. Right now, it's a grid, so it's just a parallel street that maybe has a few more stop signs on it. Of course, if you do that to the collector, that's not going to work so much. Defeats the purpose of a collector. But to your point, maybe what you can do is do a road diet. Add some bike lanes that are going to narrow the street itself, which will force people to drive a little slower. And then, when you get to places like highways, I think really we need to look at some grants or something as a city to pursue more noise mitigation, because those places get really intense. I'll also add on that most of the sound from a motor vehicle isn't coming from the engine itself, except when it's below 30 miles an hour or so. And so electric cars just aren't going to fix this across the board. I'm very grateful for the lack of tailpipe emissions from an electric car, but if it's traveling 40 miles an hour, there's actually a big chance it's going to be louder because they have wider tires and they're heavier vehicles, like for like. So really, this does come down to, as you were saying, engineering solutions and policy solutions to start thinking about our roads in ways that control how fast people go and thus how much noise they emit. And have those things be respective to whether you're in a neighborhood, whether you're on a main street, whether you are on a highway. All of those things need different types of consideration for noise.
This, I hope, is a helpful tool in the toolbox for urbanists listening to consider that now when we go and say, we need more trees in my neighborhood, well, trees are another sound buffer between you and the street, as well as potentially reducing urban heat island effect and adding another sort of pedestrian amenity that makes it more attractive to walk on the street. Think about noise in the toolbox there. When you're talking about having a diverter on a street, the citywide speed limit right now, unless otherwise posted, is 20 miles an hour. That was a big victory. If it went lower, we would have quieter streets, as well as saving more lives, preventing more property damage because people driving slower do less damage. So think about this in your toolbox when it comes to urbanist interventions. A pedestrianized downtown is also a quieter, more peaceful downtown. And we didn't even get into all of the studies here, but really it makes a huge difference in persons' work habits, shopping habits, life habits when they live in a place that is generally quieter and not being interrupted intermittently by loud motorcycles, or you can sort of imagine that sort of selfish gunning it down the street thing that you get on the cars. I live right on Colfax. It happens all the time.
Yeah, I hear ya. I will also say that the 20 is plenty, the transferring all our streets to 20 miles an hour. Of course, a 20 mile an hour sign isn't going to slow down somebody who wants to drive faster than that. But what it did was it allowed the engineers over at the Department of Transportation and Infrastructure to start designing those streets for 20 mile an hour speeds, including things like speed bumps and roundabouts, the things that you're starting to see pop up in more neighborhoods across our city. So I've heard from people who say, well, what's the use in spending all this money just swapping out the signs? There's the use, right? When you talk about advocacy and changing some of these engineering choices, that was a huge win because it's going to allow all of these pretty significant changes to our neighborhoods.
I think the one other thing I'd want to point out is we understand that people want quiet. It's one of the big complaints that you hear, and when people talk about moving out of the city, one of the things they might say is that they wanted to move somewhere quiet. So we should take that literally sometimes. Yeah. It's not impossible. Other cities across the world have taken steps to make the densest parts of their cities a little quieter, a little bit more often. And the same way that we think that any amount of reduction in ozone pollution has benefits, we should just start to think about noise as a pollutant in a serious way, even while we acknowledge, yeah, it's a city, and we're going to do concerts in Civic Center Park.
Right. Yeah, that's a great point and a great place to end. Thanks so much for chatting with me about noise today, and thank you for listening.
This has been the Denver Urbanism Podcast, courtesy of longstanding blog Denver Urbanism and our sister blog Denver Infill. You can find more information on the website denverurbanism.com, and we look forward to your comments and feedback online. Thanks very much.
All right, here we go. Hello. I already messed up. I forgot my name. This is gonna be the cold open. Like cold close.